We will be looking at in this lecture the topic international criminalization of corruption, comparative anti-corruption regimes. In other words, we will be considering how the phenomenon of corruption manifests itself in international relations and the problems that this poses for international law and how international law indeed has been responding to the prevalent problem of corruption. We will therefore be looking at the definition of corruption. We'll be looking at some of the definitions offered out there. We will be looking at we will be rebutting the assumption in popular imagination and indeed in literature that corruption is a phenomenon best typified by its existence and its manifestation in the developing world. We'll be rebutting that by presenting examples and evidence of corruption as a global problem, not a developing state schism. We will be also looking at how international law has responded to this in the use of soft law standards, various forms of recommendations, and of course, then the treaty law that governs the area, the UN treaty, and a few other regional treaties and conventions that specialize on the mischief of corruption. And we will be looking at how corruption can be combated by a universal response to the duty of asset recovery. So how do you trace funds back to the states where they should belong, trace it from the states where the proceeds of corruption emanated from to the usual venues in international relations and in international, in the way, the directions in which capital flows, illegal capital particularly, flows to certain states in the developed north. How do you get your money back? Indeed, we will also be looking at how you get your money back generally, not just from the developing world to the developed world, but examples also exist of developing world money ending up in developing world venues, developing money, world money ending up in developed states money ending up in developing states, developed states money ending up in developed states. It's a global problem, it's a global issue, and this is why we have to look at it in a course like this. And that's what we intend to do. So let's give it a go. Corruption is a human problem. It's a problem that manifests itself around the world. It's a problem that's always been there from the very beginnings of civilization. You find examples and passages of the Bible dealing with the problem of corruption. The children of Samuel, several kings in the Bible. You find similar stories, passages in the Quran. You find examples of how the divine view on corruption is wrong in Christian theology. You find it in Buddhist, Hinduism, in Ifa mythology. You find that it's a human trait to rebuff corruption. It's a human trait to recognize corruption. It's a human trait to want it to be brought to a rapid end, and indeed to punish and to attach sanctions to the corrupt. You find that the corpus of international law today knows what corruption is. even though the definitions may vary. You also find that there is a response towards business corruption, particularly across the world, in a way that shows that there is no culture. There is no culture that does not recognize that corruption is something that ought to be brought to an end, to the extent that I predict that with the direction of things in international law, corruption, particularly grand corruption, which is the corruption that takes place amongst those who are of the uh, governmental class, those who are in government position, that kind of corruption is likely going to assume the 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 form of an international crime that demands universal jurisdiction. That's the prediction I have, that international corruption will soon be one of those issues in which countries have a universal jurisdiction over, much along the same lines as we are witnessing the development of an international universal jurisdiction over terrorists and pirates. The question then is, how do we conceptualize corruption? Corruption is difficult to define, and the many definitions that exist out there uh, try to cover the issue, but I suggest they will, of course, they will be deficient in one way or the other. This is the reason why we are obliged in such situations to look at definitions across various sources and various authors. Let's start by looking at the Black Law Dictionary. The Black Law Dictionary's definition of corruption is that it encompasses an act which allows anyone to do something with an intent to give some advantage inconsistent with the official duty and the rights of others. It's usually the act of an official or someone in fiduciary position who unlawfully and wrongfully uses his or her station to procure benefits to him or herself or for another person, contrary to the duty and rights of others. As definitions coming from law dictionaries go, that is both satisfactory and unsatisfactory. It is satisfactory to the extent that it touches on many of the points we want to see, but it does not point enough at the dirtiness that corruption has come to have in conceptualization by other people who look at the problem. The dirtiness at the bottom of corruption usually is what one can call an irritating taboo, irritating, dirty act, something shameful, something smelly. And this is the kind of definition you will find even in the words that are used for the corruption in many languages. The language, the word devoted for corruption in many languages, in the Mandarin language, for instance, in Yoruba language, the word itself denotes dirtiness. It does not just talk about the issues or the legal issues like the Black Law Dictionary is talking about rights, duties, unlawfully, wrongfully, even if it is not wrongful, even if it is not lawful, or even if it is lawful, acts of corruption usually would be acts that encompass some shame. Hence, we have to take other definitions, like the definition given by a Nigerian jurist who says Corruption is the use of power by anybody for capricious or arbitrary purposes, foreign to that which it is meant to have. The Transparency International defines corruption as an abuse of entrusted power for private gain. An abuse of power for private gain. With all these definitions and the many other definitions which I would urge you to have a look at, you would see that corruption is difficult to define, but at the major points of it is the abuse of position with the added benefit to the person who abused the position or any other person who he chooses to exercise a discretion wrongfully for. Let's move on and agree that it will be difficult to define corruption, but it is possible to conceptualize it lawfully or under the law. One of the things I do annually when I teach this course is to look at the Transparency International index, which comes out annually, and it's one of the things aficionados of this topic will look into: which country is making progress, which country is dropping behind, and all that. And there's this interesting visual graphic that's usually given on an annual basis, which shows how serious corruption is from using the spectrums of colors between yellow or amber and red. We will find out that most of the countries that are deep red remain deep red. We will also find out that there are some slight changes in the color, and I do the very interesting thing of checking this, even if it's not exactly scientific. No, well, the scientific thing is in the index itself. You can see which countries are going backwards. But from this visual spectrum of colors alone, one can see that certain countries tend to be represented as very clean on one side, and certain countries are highly corrupt and are represented by deep red colors. But I noticed that the 2016 and 2017 tables are quite similar to each other. But if one looks at the 2020 table, one will see, and I find that very interesting, that some of the yellow countries have somewhat darkened. Unless I'm imagining this, I can see that they seem to have darkened. It cannot be that the authors, I urge you to have a look at the Transparency International webpage for perhaps clearer representations of what I'm talking about. But what seems to worry me is that if it is indeed true that the American continent has darkened, that is something, and when I say the American, well, the United States of America particularly, has darkened in its own manifestation of the amber color and is now going towards red. That indeed is something to pay attention to. That's something interesting and something we should pay attention to. So, corruption is here and it's a universal problem. All countries are corrupt, despite the unsatisfactory assumption that there are countries that are yellow and therefore not corrupt. I don't think there's any human population anywhere. If human beings move to Mars, there will be corruption on Mars, as we do we do anticipate there's going to be a Mars colony, perhaps in our lifetime. Whether or not that happens, I am bold enough to make the prediction that corruption is going to be something that will be found on any colony, Mars or not, Moon or wherever, or an asteroid, wherever we place it. we will have corruption there. It is the wheel that turns global business, unfortunately. The total value of bribes paid in corruption, in corrupt payments for all kinds of reasons exceeds $1 trillion every year. It is a cancer that steals from the poor, eats away at governance and the moral fiber, and destroys trust. It is not something you should ignore in global politics. It's not something we can afford to ignore in business because it actually brings down businesses. It brings down profits. It may be that some companies or even some countries gain momentarily on it, but anything that distorts fair competition between companies, between businesses, between states is ultimately bad for everyone. And it should not be allowed to continue. The statistics are not impressive at all. The amount of monies what we pay annually in bribes, the fact that a lot of the economies that we see doing well are actually doing well by sailing on the winds of money laundering, that the proceeds of money laundering, at least a third of it, if not half of it, somehow passes through the United States economy. The fact that all these bribes and many of the transactions that are corrupt takes place through the American dollar. All this shows that we are sailing on the winds of corruption globally. And that's not something that is satisfactory because it does have serious blowbacks. It has serious effects on our lives, individually and collectively. Corruption kills. Corruption leads to wars. Corruption leads to famine. Corruption leads to various parts of the world living under the threat of rebel groups that are mining the seized territory from legitimate governments, start mining, whether it's coltan, whether it's gold, whether it's whatever, and then selling it, even oil, selling it on the legitimate market, or at least to legitimate buyers around the world, and that continues to finance wars and troubles and death. And as I said earlier, the equivalent of the Boko Haram, ISIS. People buy and countries buy oil from ISIS, knowing very well that ISIS is the very antithesis of international order, is the very antithesis of international law. And we still find existing countries buying from stolen oil from countries across the world, from Nigeria, from other countries, from Iran, and all this just leads to more and more of conflict and death. It kills us in so many ways. It kills us through the fact that the businesses that should not exist, that are allowed to exist, and those that are supposed to exist that have to be killed off due to corruption. This is all bad news, terrible bad news. And it's escalating. And again, as I said, the last thing we want to do is to assume that this is a problem of the developing world alone. This is not a problem of the developing world. This is a problem of everyone. This is a problem that shows that if we do not address it, it's going to bring the house down. And what do I mean by bringing the house down? It's going to make sure that nobody escapes, no civilization amongst us is going to do well, whereas others are going to suffer it alone. Ultimately, corruption affects every single state in the world, and us to be looked at from that perspective. So let's look at how corruption affects the West, because there's this assumption that the West is immune from corruption. It's a terrible assumption. It's something that never should. Anyone who is serious and has a few brain cells will tell you that you can detect corruption in in the so-called free world, in the so-called developed world as well. And I'll give a few examples. The cards of corruption keep falling everywhere. We look at it, from the recent jailing of Sarkozy. Sarkozy has just been the former president of France, nearly immediate past, has just been found guilty of corruption while in office, and this is the tip of the iceberg. Before him, Mitterrand was like that. Before him, we've also found or the president of Italy in all kinds of corruption scandals. Eventually, as it's always is, it's not the naira, sorry, it's not the dollar and pound and pence that brought him down, but things like Bunga Bunga Party. And when we say Bunga Bunga Party, I'm making reference here to the sex scandals and perhaps the interest in underage girls that a former president of Italy, Silvia Berlusconi had. Then we have Spain, we have the UK. It's ongoing, it's relentless, it's covered up by the press. The press does not make enough assertion. They're happy to find out corruption in the developing world. They're happy to it occurs in the developing. When it occurs at home, when it occurs in the UK, when it occurs in France, when it occurs in the US, they give it fancy names. They tap dance around the issue and pretend that it's not as bad as it is. But thankfully, once in a while, and I'm quite happy about a Transparency International study, which came out around 2015, which shows us that in the UK alone, and they're not studying any other places, a UK specific report, the issues I have highlighted in this table are found to exist: bribery, collusion, conflict of interest, cronyism, and nepotism. What we call revolving door arrangements, where people move from political parties into appointments in boards and back into senior appointments in government, and so on and so forth. That's revolving door corruption. Fraud. Serious fraud office is always busy. Even the serious fraud office itself recently came up for not just criticism, but a scandal involving corruption, dodgy gifts and hospitality arrangements that are that are beyond the pale, lobbying, money laundering. London is a money laundering center of the world. And when we say London is a money laundering center of the world, we are not even accounting for the full picture. The full picture is that the UK itself is a global magnet of corrupt funds. And when we say the UK, we're not talking about the physical place of the UK alone, but all its satellite jurisdictions that are connected to the UK's economy, particularly the so-called the tax jurisdictions that report back and are under the control of the UK, the Cayman Islands, the Bahamas, Gibraltar, and so on and so forth. There's a web of jurisdictions, ex-colonies around the world that are tied to the UK economy and that are being used as tax islands to attract funds from around the world and ultimately to service the UK economy. So when we're discussing money laundering in the world, it's not possible to ignore the central position that a country like the UK occupies. So in international politics, in international manifestation of corruption, the UK is very well represented in a bad way. But even in national politics, we keep seeing yearly, annually, uh, stupendous happenings that no one would ever have predicted will happen in a country like this, where you suddenly find that highly placed men and women fall short, not only of moral standards, but of financial standards. And they end up sometimes paying for it. But the thing to note is that when we find one person paying for it, the thing to take home, the real take home is not that we found one person now and that's the one problem we have in the country and it's been taken care of. No, that's not how crime works. That's not how criminal problems work. That's not how international mischief works. The fact is, for each person you do find, and if you are lucky enough to take it down to a conviction, which can be used as an example for others around the world and for your own population, a huge percentage of people got away with it. Crime and the justice gap, as we call it, works like that. It's not about the people you have arrested, it's not about the people you've successfully convicted or who throw their hands off. It's about those who got away with it. And they tend, logically, to be in higher numbers than we even think of. That's how it works. That's how it works across all criminal activities, including corruption. So when we find someone, we should take from that the need to convict that person, but also the need to look further and to search further and to dig deep to find the rot wherever it may be. So the 2011 MP's expenses scandal is one I will urge you again to have a look at in recent literature, uh, journalistic coverage. You should have been able to notice that. Uh, there's so much, so much. There's a lot indicating that the corruption at home is linked up with the operations abroad of multinationals, particularly multinational companies. Multinational companies are the engine of corruption across the world, and most of the multinational companies have their headquarters and their investors and their shareholders based in the developed world, which is why you cannot discuss corruption, international corruption, particularly international business corruption, without looking at how the elites in the developed world sponsor multinational corporations, indeed sponsor the change of government, sponsor the military industrial complex, sponsor the coups in weaker countries, as Mark Thatcher and Simon Mann, public school boys who decided that it was a good idea to change the government of a small African state until they were caught. And then they did just a few years in prison because immense pressure was brought by the developed countries in contacts to get them out of jail, even after conviction. And when I say get them out of jail, I'm talking about the people who were arrested during the carrying out of the coup, such as Simon Mann. Mark Thatcher never spent a day in jail. In fact, he never spent a day facing trial because he was able to use his connections as the son of the former prime minister in the UK to get away from even an extradition or an arrest. And the same thing goes on and on and on and on. Rwanda, the son of Mitterrand, the former president of France, was implicated in that terrible genocidal situation as well. So it just goes on and on and on. And then we cannot forget the banking crimes that go on till today, the banking crimes that have taken us down the line of having uh, a recession in 2009, really hasn't cleared up to today, and now is linking up with the COVID-19 pandemic and Brexit to make our lives most horrid over the next few years. Who knows? Maybe decades. Bankers have been swiping the system. The banking profession systematically has been operating under the use of an unhealthy, uh, corrupt bonus culture, a bonus culture that rewards criminal conduct, that rewards hyper dangerous investment products, that has led to the labor scandal, for instance, and so on and so forth. We also have the fact that the banking failures have led to sickness, death, unemployment for hundreds of millions, and some of the pensions that people will receive over the next 20, 30, 40 years is already lost, and some of it is endangered. And we owe all this to the banking profession, which ought to be operating under stricter, cleaner standards, but which is allowed to get away with it. So, corruption is something which is engaged in by the powerful. The powerful use it as a tool. It indeed is a tool of destruction of other societies. We use it, we use it as a weapon. We allow corruption in some parts of the world to service the economy of the developed world. And then we allow the corruption to be used as a tool to destroy certain regimes and to destroy certain governments in foreign lands that we don't want. Otherwise, how do you explain the fact that the London property market has become the magnet of, of corrupt funds across the world? There is a Transparency International TI study, which came out around 2017, which I have quoted here, which shows that the UK housing market is such a magnet for global corrupt funds that it not only destroys the countries where the funds disappear from to get invested in UK market, it also destroys the UK home population's chances of getting accommodation in one of the best cities in the Western world, because the corrupt funds come in and buy flats in the choicest places, and those flats, nobody would live there. They just get closed because they are just investments. And then the original population, the teachers, the policemen, the civil servants, the young people who are growing up now cannot live in London, but have to live in the suburbs or even further afield, just to be able to find a place where there's some semblance of normal rents can be paid. The rich do not care whether anybody rents there. Well, we're talking about the super rich here, the ones that invest millions. They don't care really whether anybody lives in their property or rents it. Some of them actually prefer the properties not to be rented, but they are using it as a store of value. So in one investment, in one London development, we found out that up to 1.6 billion pounds was of property was invested in one place, and that a huge percentage of that uh, cohort of investors, of buyers of the property, come from abroad. And these are not, they don't just come from abroad. We're talking about those who are involved in grand corruption in their homelands, who have just decided to store their stolen wealth in buying flats that will be kept empty, often in the UK. And that's corruption in the properties markets. How about corruption in the defense sector, corruption in the wars that we find going on in international relations, the wars that we talk about in the earlier parts of this module when we're looking at uh, use of force. Uh, Unfortunately, many of the wars we see found being fought in the world, including some of the non-international wars, the wars of secession and wars of domestic, uh, domestic, domestic civil wars. Many of them are being engineered from abroad. They are being engineered by those who invest in the military, in the so-called military industrial complex. Companies that produce bullets unendingly. We have factories that never shut down, producing guns 24 hours, producing weapons. We have the ongoing research yeah, and innovation on the most destructive possible weapons. And all this needs markets. So as we have those who are producing the weapons and investing in it, we also have those who are looking for a market in it and engineering the situations uh, that where the products and the new editions that are being made, the newer innovations that are coming out will be practiced and will be used on hapless and hopeless populations across the world. War is a racket. It's a terrible racket. It is one that is one of the oldest. Generals make money from war. Merchants make money from what? War. Statesmen make money from war. Companies make money from war. So they invest in this, and this is the top of corruption, if you ask me, from my view. So, in a sense, anyone who is looking at the problem of corruption and does not look at it as something which all countries are guilty of is not being truthful, and is not ready to look at the solutions to corruption. For as long as we make the dichotomy between corruption in the developing world and corruption in the developed world, we are not making a correct diagnosis of how difficult it is to get rid of corruption in international law and in international relations. And therefore, we need to look at how international law can address corruption, how international law can provide a more smarter set of solutions to the removing the problem of corruption. We also have to look at how international relations can help countries to get their funds back, and how law can indeed compel those states that are magnets of money laundering funds, compel them to assist those who have lost money to get their monies back. To do that, we perhaps need to look at the many bases. Just a second. The basis of criminal jurisdiction in international law. And the basis of criminal jurisdiction include the territorial or territoriality principle, the nationality principle, the protective or principle, the passive personality principle, the universality principle. The territorial principle is simple and quite easy to understand. States should have the power to inquire into corruption and the criminal acts surrounding corruption, including money laundering, simply on the basis that if the corruption took place on their territory. The nationality principle is similar to the territoriality principle based on the natural connection between the states and the persons that are being accused of corruption or persons who are involved in the companies that are facing corruption charges. The protective principle simply says that states may need to exercise jurisdiction over corruption crimes based on the need to secure the state, based on the need to keep to protect the interests of the states. And so therefore, every time someone acts abroad that with an intention to create damage in their state, and we're looking at it in the context of corruption here, it provides a basis to exercise criminal jurisdiction, because the general rule is that criminal jurisdiction ought to be kept at home. Criminal jurisdiction and the making of laws and criminalization of conduct, according to the laws of many countries, and indeed according to the judicial interpretation, laws are construed first and foremost to have effect at home. So the protective and the passive personality principle are a bit of an exception, including the universality principle, and I'll come to explain why the universality principle also does that. Both the protective principle and the passive personality principle are exceptions to that general rule that criminal jurisdiction should be exercised at home to everyone who is found in the territory at home, or to everyone who is a national and engages in criminal conduct even abroad. But the protective principle and the passive personality principle are exceptions to the extent that on the basis of keeping the security of the state intact, countries are allowed to exercise jurisdictions abroad to make sure that they do not let people get away with criminal conduct. Same thing, the passive personality principle. Anyone abroad who acts against the state or nationals of the state might trigger off the passive personality principle jurisdiction, allowing a state to pursue the interests of its citizens, protecting its citizens abroad to bring them to book. The universality principle is what I started off by hoping for at the beginning of this lecture, that we might be approaching a future where corruption as a crime, particularly international corruption, grand corruption, and acts of corruption that have effects abroad, is beginning to take on is beginning to acquire the universality of criminal jurisdiction for all states. So we're going to enter into a period now looking at the way the web of conventions and international law from the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of just a I'm just trying to make sure that that I'm still visible in the Zoom recording, and it seems that all seems to still be well, although my view has changed, and I don't know why that is. Why is it that I have suddenly moved from one side of the screen to the other? I hope all is still going well. Fine. Yeah. So what I'm saying is, you will find out that with the web of laws that are developing from the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which gives the American jurisdiction power to punish bribery of foreign officials, to the Bribery Act of the United Kingdom, to developments like that in French law, in German law, allowing the countries to inquire into whether their businessmen bribe foreign government officials. We are beginning to see a tightening of the noose on the corrupt persons. We are beginning to see that it's not enough to export your criminal conduct and hope that you will not, no jurisdiction will reach you. We are getting to a stage where states now have extraterritorial jurisdiction, and that's very important to combat corruption. Not only that, international conventions are also giving states a duty to act and a duty to seek help, cooperation for asset recovery, for investigations abroad. When we enter into a future where there's a mass and coagulation of these legal regimes, we will suddenly discover that there is already in place a universal jurisdiction over the crime of corruption, much along the same lines as we have discovered that there is a universal jurisdiction against pirates, against those who engage in terrorism. We are still, I must confess, not yet there, but that's the pattern that is beginning to emerge, and it takes some proof. We still need to prove that we are getting there. But as we speak, some states using the universal jurisdiction can, whether unsuccessfully, they find that they can't do it, or successfully they indeed do it. Universal jurisdiction is one of the bases of exercise of criminal jurisdiction, and it's one which we should keep our eyes open for in discussion in this area. Am I going forward? Going back? I think going back. Yes, the need for universal reach is one which several writers are asking for. Ziegler notes, when drug dealers are caught in America, their Swiss accounts figure in their dossiers. The money for the arms traffic in the Middle East and Asia goes by way of Geneva. That's just how the international economy is now wired. A lot of the negative things we find happening in the US, in developed countries, in the developing world, emanate from people who first hibernate their funds in Dubai, in the Middle East. They hibernate their funds, they keep their funds there, and then sometimes they even go there to live. And from there, they plan and perfect their actions to take place in the US, to take place in, for instance, the worst, singular and worst criminal act, criminal act of terrorism that took place in our generation, which is the September 11 attacks that led to the death of 3,000 people and more in one single evening, morning to evening, one day. We find out that the funds for that was arranged through Dubai institutions. We also find out that some of the people who carried out the crime were based in, were nationals of the UAE, and then nationals of Saudi Arabia. What I'm trying to say there is that there is a universal web of corruption which services the needs of terrorists, which services the need of rebel groups, which services the need of secessionists across the world. And this web tends to spin from some of the most delectable places, places that you would love to live in, places that everybody considers as paradises on earth. Panama City, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Bahamas, lovely places like that. But from there, capital flows out to either damage economies by soaking their money and bringing it to those metropoles, or from there, capital goes out to finance terrible events that we don't even want to spend, some of which we've talked about earlier. What needs to be done now is to look at how international law has responded to all this, and it has responded to it by developing soft laws. Soft laws at first to try to encourage countries and companies in countries to act in disciplined manners in a way to prevent much of the problems we've been talking about, money laundering particularly. So we have the creation of accelerated response teams, G8, group of 8, asset recovery workshops. We have the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, which has been domesticated into several countries, practice of extractive industries. You have the Zambia Extractive International Initiative. We have the Nigerian Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. We have the several Angolan Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. These initiatives are meant to throw more light and transparency into how much companies actually make in their extractive activities in developing states. It used to be that you could keep this secret. You don't even have to tell the people of those countries how much mining you are doing and how much you are making as a company. You didn't have to put your profits here. You didn't have to put how much you've made. You didn't have to say anything about the taxes you pay. But with this kind of soft law, encouraging companies to declare their profits, to pay, to publish what they earn. This kind of projects bring in the much needed transparency in difficult sectors that we are talking about. Then we have international conventions, the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, the emergence of the Financial Action Task Force, which operates in many countries by creating financial intelligence units. All this come together to create international standards that are useful for preventing corruption and dealing with the effects of corruption. And like I said much earlier, some of them are international, some of them are regional, some of them are national. I've talked about the national ones, like the laws like the Bribery Act, which I will still come to, the FCPA, which I will still come to. But we're talking about regional, like the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption, like the African Convention Against Corruption. All these regional and multilateral treaties come together to do just what I've said, to criminalize corruption and to create an obligation to bring corruption and corrupt practices to a halt. The most important international treaty in this area, of course, is the UN Convention Against Corruption, adopted in December 2003. very fashionably and very logically after the terrible events of the September 11, which, if one is going to be cynical, one would say that the UNCAC would not have seen the light of day as soon as it did, or in the way it did, if the terrible events of September 11 did not come to remind the powerful states that they do have they have something to gain in bringing some discipline to the terrible world of corruption, because clearly most of what happened in the planning of the September 11 hijacks would not have been able to take place, but for the fact that money laundering regime was poor, that business was being used to finance terrorism. So it was quite easy. Yeah, after that momentous, I shouldn't call it momentous because momentous does have a connotation of positive in it. I should call it perhaps epochal development of the terrorist attack, epoch-making, notorious event. It became easier to make laws like the UNCAC 2003, and that convention criminalizes international corruption. It's one thing to know that corruption is dirty, like I said in the beginning of the lecture, is that it's immoral, but not all countries agree on the morality of certain acts of corruption. So bringing countries to the same definition, the same description, the same acceptance of need to criminalize corruption was not an easy thing, and it was a very good thing to have taken place in the first place, at any rate. Putting in place the need for international cooperation, putting in place Chapter 5 of the UNCAC to deal with asset recovery, putting in place Chapter 3 of the Convention to deal with criminalization, like I said, embezzlement, misappropriation, making sure that states have a duty to put in their own national laws. Criminalization of corruption was a huge step forward, and one that we should not we should celebrate. Having said that, UNCAC, as important as it is, has its problems. UNCAC still very unimaginatively sticks to the understanding that criminal jurisdiction needs to be territorial. UNCAC does not encourage the universality principle that I've been talking about. The universality principle can happen per chance, or if things go on like this, based on the political will of states to argue for it and to accept it. But UNCAC would have been a lovely occasion. The drafting of UNCAC would have been the perhaps a bit more ahead of its time. Nothing stops it from doing that by looking at corruption as a universal problem and encouraging universal responses to corruption. So that's one possible criticism. Another criticism one can have is that UNCAC is still very much based on the coincidence of political will, that countries want to sign up to it, that countries want to have similar margin of appreciation of what their obligations are under the UNCAC rules. So to that extent, UNCAC is still somewhat unsatisfactory. And I did mention, apart from the territoriality issue, that the yes, the provisions of UNCAC were fitting for the period it was made, but looking back now, one can say that UNCAC has not done enough in making sure that states not only make laws in their own state in a particular fashion, but the provisions of UNCAC itself, in a sense, is watered down. I can understand all this because it's in itself a unique law, a unique international law treaty, which we're happy to have, and it's the first of its kind. Yeah, but it doesn't have, it's not concrete enough in several ways, including in the setting up of monitoring mechanisms. Oh yes, UNCAC has this mechanism where every 2 years, and I've attended about 2 or 3 of these actually. The last one is in Dubai, and the one before that in in Athens keeps coming to mind, but it's definitely not Athens. It's oh my God, a European country next to Germany, next to I'll remember. It takes place every 2 years. Every 2 years, you find all the countries that have signed up to UNCAC coming to this jamboree of an event where they read uh, they read the things they've been doing in their country in furtherance of UNCAC obligations. They praise themselves and pat themselves at the back, and everybody goes home thereafter. But that's not a concrete monitoring mechanism. There's nobody in the sense of a body, a standing statutory international body that actually goes out to monitor the way in which countries give effect to the rules. So meeting every 2 years at various capitals around the world to give a talk on what you self-assess yourself on is not a good monitoring mechanism. Furthermore, the poverty around the world, the poverty in the developing world, the, the low salaries and sometimes no salaries that countries pay their staff, including some of their serious staff, security profession, including politicians, means that many of these provisions will simply not be given effect to because people need to, in quote, survive. And therefore, the poverty, the cycle of poverty that we experience in international relations means that the UNCAC, as good as it is as a law, is not fulfilling its what one will call its destiny. Now I've come up with the name of the country where the last two, the penultimate event took place is Vienna. I don't know why Vienna of all names could leave my mind. So Vienna was the last UNCAC plenary where states gave reports on this what they've been doing, and then after that is Abu Dhabi, and in just about a year's time we'll be having another jamboree where states will come and do exactly what I've said, pat themselves on the back, and then go home, and God knows what happens thereafter, at great cost to international peace, because the more international corruption goes on, the more we find money to finance ISIS, the more we find money to finance several terrible organizations like Boko Haram. The military industrial complex makes money from corruption. Companies make money from corruption. The proceeds of corruption is plowed back into terrorism. and we create this terrible mess that we all live in. Well, the good news is that the FCPA, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of the US, is closing the gap. The Bribery Act of the United Kingdom is trying its best to close the gap. If one follows the guidelines, if companies follow the guidelines of the Bribery Act, they will contribute less to the problem of corruption. And how can they follow the Bribery Act's injunctions? They follow it by doing simple things like making sure that before they enter into any transactions abroad, they do their due diligence. Due diligence is something that you have to show that you are aware of the problems that can occur in your exposure abroad. You also do things like making sure that there's top-level commitment to combating corruption, that there's training of all staff in the issues surrounding transparency and corruption, that there's retraining of all staff, that you take investigations seriously. This kind of guidelines help that you have effective implementation, clear, practical, and accessible policies and procedures. They all come together to make sure that the problem of corruption is reduced. We perhaps will never get to a situation where corruption disappears, but we can do a lot to help in making corruption recede rather than increase. Lastly, I would like to talk about the problem of tracing noxious funds. What do I call noxious funds? Corrupt funds. The proceeds of corruption, the proceeds of monies that are stolen across the world is what I call noxious funds. How do you trace this? You trace it first and foremost by relying on provisions in the UNCAC regime. You trace it by relying on diplomacy. It's always a diplomatic act to trace corruption, funds of corruption across the world. Asset recovery is something that is needed in a world where up to 40 billion US dollars are stolen annually from developing countries, and they end up in the financial institutions and financial banks, the coffers of financial centers around the world. So it's a huge problem. It's one that takes place on an annual basis, but it can be done. It can be done. We can reduce this. We can reduce this, and we have been reducing it. This is the good news in international law that, like I said, international law responds with soft law, responds with treaties. In the area of soft law and arrangements, we have to pronounce, celebrate the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative. That has been one of the golden platforms in which much has been done in asset recovery in international relations. And it's something that is something that should be celebrated and has been bringing in the dollars back to economies where it's been stolen from. Furthermore, countries are now learning how to use administrative actions to freeze assets rapidly. They have been using more of their own internal resources to proactively enter into investigation. We are getting to a stage where countries don't want to become notorious. Even some of the most egregious jurisdictions are now learning to discipline themselves. They're now bringing in smarter laws. They're bringing in non-conviction-based confiscation. So we are inverting now the burden of proof. The burden of proof is no longer on the state, but it's now on the corrupt sometimes to come and justify their wealth. So that the Ukrainian politician's wife, who is in London and exhibiting a lifestyle that cannot be backed up by the salary of his spouse or her spouse, in another country needs to justify the wealth is exhibiting. So unexplained wealth orders on UWO that we find in countries like the UK is now making life more difficult for the corrupt. You have to show us where this wealth comes from. If you don't, then we have the right to confiscate the wealth, and you can't continue having it. This narrows the gap, the wide gap that seems to exist, and makes it possible for developing states, particularly, to benefit from the closed, the closing of the gap that we're talking about. Essentially, the job of a developing state that has its monies being found in developed state coffers, or vice versa, the same principles work, is to get the money back. There are 5 steps I would very quickly recommend. First, your accounting and budgetary transparency regime at home must be robust enough to even know that monies have discovered, have eloped, or have been taken away, or have been stolen. If you do not detect, and this happens more often than people even realize, that countries are not even aware of how much of their wealth is being stolen. They are not aware that their oil is being extracted, or their mines are being extracted, and the monies are being ferried abroad and never to come back. If you are not aware, then it's a non-starter. It's a non-starter. So being able to detect the loss is your first aim. The first thing you should aim for as a victim state. You should be able to detect that you've lost funds. You should be able to, you should have robust systems of budgetary accountability to raise reasonable suspicion at home. And then to know, for instance, whether the companies are paying the tax they should be paying. If your multinationals are not paying tax, if you don't have a regime of making sure that they don't get away with illicit financial flows, then there's nothing to trace. So that's why the first step is to be in a position to detect loss. Then the second step is to have robust, should I call it engagements? Should I call it cooperation? Should I call it relations with other states based on diplomacy and friendliness to be able to trigger off their legal processes. If you are not in on friendly terms with a state, if you are not members of the UNCAC together, if you are not in the same African Union together, if you are not in the same Latin American Organization of Latin American States, or Organization of American States together, then you are not even in a good position to ask for help, or to ask for legal assurances, or to ask for legal obligations. Asset recovery is a legal step, but it's also a diplomatic step. And being able to develop good relations and good competence in this area is something that will help anyone who's involved in asset recovery. Freezing and demobilization of assets, being able to trigger the freezing of assets by other states, either diplomatically or through their courts, or through their financial intelligence units and their own economic and financial commissions, is a step that needs to be taken. Hopefully, after doing the first 3 successfully, then you need to kickstart the actual return and repatriation of stolen funds. This happens again and again with more frequency. It happens, as we will see in the next 2 slides, looking at just a 3-year gap, and much more has happened since then. Monies do get returned. They get returned from developing states to developed states. They get returned from developed states to developing states. They get returned from developed states to developed states. That's the good news. And being able to get this done is the bread and butter of the step of asset recovery. Hopefully, one can add that being able to use the returned funds to do good things at home, incorporating it into projects of high impact impression at home, using the funds that were lost and then regained to show the citizenry that you actually care, that you use it in building clinics in rural areas, you use it in building important bridges, you use it in education, whatever it is that will satisfy and satiate the minds of the citizenry, and maybe even your foreign critics and your foreign partners, is an important stage in asset recovery. Lastly, I would say stem the flow. Make sure that robust systems that prevent illicit financial flows in the first place are in place, that you have taxation systems that do not allow foreign companies or your local companies to not pay their taxes or not pay enough of their taxes, and to fool you using headquarters placed elsewhere, shell companies, using various forms of hiding funds. If you don't allow them to get away with this, that's the best place you want to be as a state. Having said all this, I think it needs to be said that the problem of corruption in the international system is one that is a current global problem, and will increase unless and until we have a perfect world, and we are never going to have a perfect world. So many of the problems we deal with in this course are going to have a recurrent value. Hence, we need more thinking and rethinking of the solutions that international law provides. And we need better solutions to deal with the problems. Thank you very much for listening. And that's the end of the lecture.